Texas Transportation Institute, and they're going to be talking to us about dealing with pedestrians in work zones. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to make just a few reminders for you. Today's session is being taped and will be available for viewing, of course, at no cost online at the Workzone Clearinghouse. That's workzonesafety.org, and that'll be online by Friday. Also, if you're interested in professional development hours, that form is also online at the Workzone Clearinghouse, workzonesafety.org. We also would like to remind you that next year in 2010, the Clearinghouse will be presenting 2 power workshops, one in March in Cincinnati, Ohio, and another in June in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I'll have more information on those 2 power workshops, again free, at the end of this presentation. To begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jerry Ullman. Jerry is the Senior Research Engineer and Manager of Workzone and Dynamic Message Sign Program at the Texas Transportation Institute at Texas A&M University. He holds a PhD in Civil Engineering from Texas A&M and has been with TTI since 1985. He's conducted numerous studies on workzone safety and mobility-related topics for state and national sponsors and has authored over 100 articles and technical reports. He also leads TTI's efforts in operating the National Workzone Safety Information Clearinghouse in cooperation with ARPA and the Federal Highway Administration. He's a registered professional engineer in Texas. So, welcome, Jerry Ullman.
Thanks, Brad. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity today to be here with y'all. Want to also thank the Federal Highways for supporting the Clearinghouse in these webinars. We hope that you'll find the information we have to share with you today useful and practical, that immediately implementable. My presentation is titled Designing and Maintaining a Pedestrian-Friendly Work Zone. This work came out of some research that we actually did for the Texas Department of Transportation. I'd like to acknowledge them and thank them for their support on this. And again, our goal here this afternoon is this morning to give you some tips, hopefully some good information you all could take back and implement immediately in your projects across the country. To start with, I think it's important, most of you all are well aware, the MUTCD does specifically address pedestrians as an important component of work zone traffic control. In fact, as you see here in the section that's paraphrased, all road users, we think of motorists most often when we're talking about work zone traffic control, but bicyclists, pedestrians, are also considered road users. All have to be dealt with and accommodated as part of work zone traffic control in utility maintenance and construction operations. The MUTCD does specify or provide some general guiding principles to be followed in dealing with pedestrians, bicyclists in work zones. First of all, pedestrians shouldn't be led into conflicts with work operations, work vehicles, work equipment. They should not be led into conflicts with other traffic, other vehicles that are trying to move through or around the work site. Should be provided a reasonably safe, convenient, and accessible path, and then also not have their routes severed due to parked vehicles or equipment from the work operation. So these 4 basic principles guide or define what the requirements are relative to pedestrian accommodations in work zones. How exactly you implement that is really what we want to target today. We have developed a TCP design checklist at TTI as part of the research that I mentioned previously. It covers 11 different topic areas, things to consider, things to watch out for, things to address as part of traffic control plan designing and dealing with pedestrians. I want to run through a couple of key points on each of these so that you know kind of what we're looking for. It covers everything from diversion routes, how to deal with pavement surfaces, canopied walkways, guidance information, what's needed, what's useful, how to do that, path obstructions, access issues. A lot of the same kinds of topics that we talk about when we're talking about with motorists, we're talking about relative to pedestrians as well. And that'll be a common theme through what I have to share with you with comments today. So let's just start going down that checklist, talk about these topics one by one. Our number one topic, diversion route considerations. If it's necessary that you cannot maintain your pedestrian pathway due to a work zone, and you need to divert them, a couple of things to take in consideration. There are some basic priorities. These are based predominantly on the fact that pedestrians, just like motorists, tend to be creatures of habit. It is very difficult or can be difficult to get them to change their normal travels, paths, and decisions. So the priorities are in order of least amount of diversion and effort required to get them to deviate from their normal travel path. Certainly, if there's a parking area, parking lane that's next to the work site, that tends to be the easiest one to accommodate pedestrians through. The next level of difficulty would be actually having to close a travel lane and accommodate the pedestrians in that closed travel lane. The third priority and tends to be more difficult to deal with, both from a signing channelization standpoint and actually getting compliance, is to try to have them actually divert away from that particular path, cross a street, and utilize the other side of the street. Depending on the type of facility and the volume of traffic, a lot of factors that you have to take into consideration on a site-by-site basis. You may need to provide traffic barrier, although it's not necessarily required in all instances. Second topic area, that of separating the pedestrian path, pedestrians themselves from the work area that's going on. Certainly we need positive or some type of separation protection if there are any excavations, drop-offs present near the pedestrian pathway, just like we deal with, again, with motorists. Use of fences are often used for this purpose. Barriers can be used. Certain types of channelizing devices are all possible ways of providing this positive separation. If it is necessary to separate the pedestrian path from the work area, you need to think in terms of is this my treatment tall enough to keep from pedestrians from climbing over, and is it continuous and solid that they cannot sneak between it to cut through, for example, into your work area. Pedestrian traffic vehicle separation. Again, if it is required that your primary or the normal pedestrian path is being closed, and you're going to reroute them into the travel lane, a parking lane, making sure that pedestrians and vehicles are separated is important. High speed, like I indicated earlier, high speed facilities, high volume traffic locations may need to be separated with positive barrier separation. If that's the case, you do have to go through the analysis to make sure that the barrier itself is designed and will function and to prevent intrusions, and whether, depending on the type that's being used, the connections between segments, anchoring, all those kinds of things need to be thought through, analyzed, and to ensure that it is truly going to serve as a positive physical barrier. Some instances, lower volume facilities, lower speed facilities, may be sufficient with the use of channelizing devices to separate traffic from pedestrians. In that situation, detectable edging, our second presenter, Brooke, will be talking extensively on the use of ADA requirements as it pertains to accommodating pedestrians. I'll let her talk more about that. But detectable edging on our channelizing devices, The continuity, again, of the path being provided, all are important considerations. Third topic point, pathway width and surface needs. Again, the information, if we can, 5-foot widths are what are desirable for if you have to provide a temporary path. This allows two individuals in wheelchairs or scooters or those kind of things be able to pass side by side on the path. If it's not possible to provide that width, the MTCD indicates that it's necessary to provide a 5-by-5-foot space every 200 feet to allow a place for wheelchairs to be able to move around and pass each other in that manner. If that's not possible, the absolute minimum, a path has to be at least 3 foot wide, or you can't get a wheelchair or a scooter through there. That's the absolute minimum. And if that's all you have, then you do have to have some other type of accommodations for the wheelchair accessibility around for that path. That won't be wide enough to allow that type of a pedestrian to navigate through. So whether you've got someone that's going to pick them up and move them around, whatever it is, you have to make some sort of accommodations. You just can't say it's not possible and just ignore it. If you do have a pedestrian or a pavement, temporary pavement in particular, it has to be smooth, continuous, and hard enough to support a surface. Dirt surfaces are not sufficient for that. Detectable edging. Again, Brooke will talk about this much more extensively in her discussions, but it is a component to think about as part of the pedestrian considerations during traffic control plan designing. The edging needs to be a solid material. It can be plastic, metal, wood, whatever it needs to be. Continuous. There needs to be a bottom rail. It cannot be any higher than 6 inches. Less than 6 inches is more desirable. That helps to provide the reference point for those that are walking with canes, and that to have that reference point. It's also desirable for a second rail about hand height on challenge devices and other methods being used to control and guide pedestrians. But isn't necessarily required. Canopied walkways. Well, in a lot of our work zones, the concern may not even be within the work zone itself. It certainly can be beneath it. For example, in our little illustration here, if a work activity is occurring up above, and there are intended to be pedestrians below, and there's a potential for falling objects, debris, whatever, a canopied walkway may be needed. If a canopy walkway is being used, considerations for appropriate lighting. If the pedestrian path can be used during nighttime hours, providing that adequate lighting is also important. An additional one, a little more challenging to deal with, but an important one nonetheless, is the consideration of, have I maintained adequate sight distance, sight lines as part of my traffic control plan, particularly between pedestrians and motorists. They need to be able to see each other at crossing points, intersections, or if you've got mid-block crossings, whatever it may be, or just moving into in and out of a parking lane, for example. Some of the things to check is whether you do have ability to see the pedestrians and motorists see each other at corners, where there's fences, whether their parking vehicles are going to obscure sight distance, sight lines to each other, signs themselves that are put up, bridge abutments, as you can see the list here, being checked to ensure that we have that. We have not provided blind or created blind corners, situations like that could pose a hazard to the pedestrian when trying to cross. Next topic: pedestrian information needs. This is a fairly major area of importance when we're designing our traffic control plans in these type of areas. Advanced information needed about sidewalk closures. I'd like to think in terms of would I do this to a motorist when designing an information system for the pedestrians? Just like we don't leave the motoring public to its own devices until they reach a closure. We provide them advance notice of what's going on and things to do. The same kind of principles apply here for pedestrians. We do want to provide clear and positive guidance all the way through, in advance of, through, and around the work area. Do want to make sure that there is information about how to get back to the original route if necessary, depending on the situation, that it's clear this is a point where the pedestrian can return back to their original path if desired. A couple more points to think about. This actually some information that came out of the research that we did for TxDOT. It is consistent with past research that we and others have done for motorist information systems, but it is something to keep in mind. First of all, when providing advanced information, the word ahead, fairly ambiguous. Providing specific information about the distance, how far ahead is the sidewalk closed, using blocks or feet, is useful. Pedestrians who are using that facility, they can then make the decision as to, well, I can continue on. I'm only going half a block down to the business on the right, or I am planning to continue. Can make those kind of effective decisions as to whether that sign is relevant to their particular trip, and make those decisions accordingly. Second point, whenever possible, providing action statements indicating to the pedestrian what you want them to do is also very useful, just as we do for providing motorists information in advance of a work zone about what we want them to do. An interesting bit of research result that we found in the TxDOT study, pedestrians generally associate the orange and black colors with more strongly with the work zone and with the need to pay attention to the information being provided. I know that the METCD provides quite a few regulatory white on or black on white signs for pedestrians that can be used, but you'll see in some of the slides we have the rest of the day the use of orange and black becoming more and more common, and from our surveys, pedestrians treat those as something that is affiliated with the work area, something they need to pay attention to because something about their normal travel paths are altered. So, other intersection needs are also important to think about. If you are changing where people are to cross, obliterating existing crosswalk markings, providing temporary crosswalk markings may be important to think about. Any traffic signal adjustments, whether it's the installation of temporary signals during a signal upgrade or something of that nature, how that temporary signal is going to accommodate the pedestrian movements if you're allowing them, or if you haven't specifically prohibited them, is something to take in consideration and has to be thought about. Path obstructions is probably one of the more significant challenges that traffic control plan designer, as well as the folks in the field, will face during a project. Do not want any fencing, any scaffolding, signs actually in the path or protruding into the path. If it has to extend in the path, it needs to be at least 7 foot high to avoid the pedestrian running into that particular obstruction with part of their body. Another key component to think about, another item in your checklist, the access considerations. This certainly includes the businesses, residences, those kinds of things. Transit is a big consideration in a lot of urban work zone projects. I have this example here just to highlight location. This person on the right is actually waiting for the bus. You can see on the left that where the bus stop has been moved across this work zone in order to and that's where the bus will stop. I think the important thing to take away from this sign, this is actually an active work area. That vehicle you see in that lane is actually moving back and forth, packing the material down, and so pedestrians are being forced to interact directly with the work vehicles to get across to that transit stop. It's something we don't want to obviously see in our work zones. Okay, so that is the checklist, the 11 different key points to take into consideration. Certainly, if you've gone through the steps, the efforts, thought about all these, have come up with what you believe is a very solid traffic control plan. The next step, getting it into the field, and then making sure that it continues to function the way you intend. Again, I like to use the analogy of a standard traffic control plan. When we design them for traffic, we put them out in the field, and then we have our field adjustments on occasion, depending on how things actually fit once you get them out in the field. There should be a check, the field implementation of each of these items I listed at the beginning of the project, after each major phase change. Are each of these items still being dealt with appropriately? Should be included the consideration of how the pedestrian traffic control is working as part of every regular inspections that we do of our other traffic control devices. These are our normal traffic control devices themselves, and should be treated as an equal, integral part of the overall traffic control plan. One thing I think that's important, it becomes more important is part of the field implementation part of the process, is the recognition that we can have accidental impacts that are above and beyond what we go through in the design process. Many work zones, there isn't intended to be a pedestrian effect. The project is viewed as not having a pedestrian influence, but if you're not careful, it can have adverse impacts and need to be dealt with. The example in the lower right-hand corner of your screen here, it's a classic example. The signing for the traffic, works on signing for traffic, is put on some temporary skids, but the decision was made here to put the skids on the sidewalk. Obviously, a wheelchair, and a motorized scooter, none of those vehicles are going to be able to get around that vehicle or that obstruction anymore, and consequently you've created a pedestrian impact, even though the project itself doesn't physically affect the pedestrian path itself. Another example of what I'll call accidental or unintended consequences to a pedestrian path. As you can see, as you're leading up here, the sidewalk disappears into the area where the construction equipment moving in and out has totally covered the path, where even though underneath there's still a hard surface, you don't have that in this situation. You can see downstream there's some material that's been deposited that has into the lane itself, and then that does look like they were intended at some point to have some control of the pedestrians, as you can see down there. Exactly what's intended is not sure. It's not known whether they're supposed to move into the street, if they're supposed to go around to the left. This one would not be something we'd like to see certainly in the field. Other types of what I'll call accidental impacts or effects, leaving materials just out on the sidewalk as part of the work activity itself. These do ultimately, as you can again think in terms of they are tripping hazards. They do impede movement from anybody on a scooter or wheelchair. Bicycles, all of these are potential victims of this kind of I will call it negligence, not taking care of the pedestrian path as part of the work activity. The impacts can all extend above and beyond where your intended project limits are. As you can see here on the right, the closure is upstream of or downstream of where problem from them that's resulting from the project is occurring here. The washout from recent rains has created a muddy section here that's a slipping hazard for pedestrians, bicyclists. In addition, you see the post that's been just left, which is also crossing the path. Again, not type of things that we want to be vigilant for at all times and remediate as quickly as possible. Example, this particular project, that's where the work was occurring. The intent was not to have any pedestrian access to that side of the work, or in that work zone. That the pedestrian path was considered to be suitable on the existing side of the street that this picture's being taken from. Unfortunately, as you can see, the traffic control was not sufficient to keep the pedestrian from getting into the work zone as they came from upstream of the work area. So they continued through the area itself without going across the street as it was intended. Makes it even more, I guess, worrisome is a lot of times we have hazards within the work area for which we weren't intending pedestrians to be moving so closely to. This was on the other side of that barrier here. And so, again, the failure to properly control the pedestrian traffic could have led to some very serious consequences from the pedestrian standpoint. This example here, we do have some pedestrian fencing on the left that can serve as a reasonable guidance for visually impaired pedestrians to follow on if they are lucky enough to recognize the left-hand side as the side that to guide on. We do unfortunately have some of those bases protruding into the work area that are tripping hazards. On the right-hand side, if unfortunately there is no type of positive continuous railing to guide against, and so it would not be something we would want to see in a pedestrian-friendly work zone. Being clear about what you intend the pedestrian to do is also critical. The sign on the left, or the picture on the left, they've actually created a new sidewalk where the provisions for access at curb ramps, those kinds of things have been provided down at the intersection. They just did not close the original ramp or original path upstream at this point. And as you can see, again, pedestrian, like motorists, were creatures of habit. This particular pedestrian following the path that they normally go until they get up to that intersection, and they're going to have to figure out how to get back and get through the work construction that's going on there and across the street. Picture on your right is a sidewalk closure that was intended to prohibit further movement. As you can see, the bicyclist, they simply just went around it into the work area because they could, and so they chose to do that. Sight lines, I indicated, being aware once you get things in the field, that it may not always be simple to look at a traffic control plan on paper and realize what are the potential sight lines. Once you get things out and you identify things that are blocking signal heads, pedestrian signal heads, those kind of things need to be remedied quickly and properly. Picture on the right, no advance notice about the sidewalk closure until you reach the point where they've physically closed. And as you can tell, the natural path is to lead the pedestrian, even though that's not the intent, into the travel lanes next to the moving traffic there, and it's what happens instead of having them divert as was intended. This example here, actually from a distance looks like somebody was trying to do a fairly good job providing a clear, positive path, what was intended as far as pedestrian travel. You see the fence being used to restrict access by pedestrians into the work area, into the canopied walkway to protect for that. The only problem was, in this example, is once you get down to the other end of the walkway here, the decision was that's where we wanted to close the sidewalk. Obviously, an undesirable consequence. First of all, making a pedestrian that gets down there has to recircle and then figure out at this point what they want to do to continue their path, whether they walk in the street or any of those types of undesirables. The other part of this is for visual or mobility impaired pedestrians. Someone in the wheelchair would get to this point, wouldn't even have room to turn around and have to most likely back out to find their alternative route. So, being cognizant of the entire path and providing that continuity from before the work zone through it into the other end is critical. And then finally, I just wanted to, I think that certainly ensuring that the signs that are used meet requirements of the METCD. Hand-painted signs do not command any type of respect. Do not convey, not readable. Should be immediately dismantled, removed if any of these end up, and appropriate signs used. So, this information comes from the following link to the TTI's website product there. You can find the very similar information. It's been condensed very well in some guidance documents that have been put together through the Federal Highway Workzone Safety Grant Program. You can find that at the Workzone Safety Clearinghouse under the ATSA subheading for these guidance documents as well. So,
thank you very much, Jerry. We appreciate your presentation to us. For those viewing, you can send questions to Jerry. We're going to hold them until the end of the presentation, but I'd ask if you have questions you can submit. There's a box on the lower left-hand part of your screen for you to type and send questions. If you have a specific presenter in mind, please put their name at the beginning, either Jerry or Brooke, and we'll direct those at the end of the session. Right now we're going to switch our presenters, and we're going to hear from Brooke Ullman. And Brooke is an assistant transportation engineer in the Signs and Markings program at the Texas Transportation Institute. She holds a Master's of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Texas A&M University and has been with TTI since 1998. Brooke conducts research on many topics, including information and work zone safety. Additionally, she has led the research project sponsored by the Texas Department of Transportation regarding pedestrians in work zones, which form the foundation for much of the information we are using today. So please welcome Brooke Ullman.
Hello. What I want to focus on right now is using different ways to get handicapped pedestrians through our work zones. And when I talk about handicapped pedestrians, the two things I really want to focus on during my discussion today is both mobility disabilities and visual disabilities. And so these two things, there's two things that probably pop to your mind real quick when I say those two words. It's wheelchairs and people who are completely blind. But there really are some varying degrees that you have to think about, especially in mobility impairments. We need to include those people who are maybe elderly, who can't maybe move as easily, or maybe some physical impairments that make it more difficult to take large steps or to step up onto things. All of these are included in that mobility impairments, and we need to start thinking about that as well as the wheelchair side of things. When we're talking visual disabilities, it really is the people who are blind, completely blind, and then you're also talking about degrees of blindness where it may just be low vision. So people aren't always going to have a cane or a dog. We need to make sure that they have a way to be able to better see what's going on. So that's why we're going to talk about multiple different ways of accommodating people who have disabilities in work zones. So I'm going to start out by talking about visually impaired pedestrians. And really, what are our concerns when we start thinking about visually impaired pedestrians and wanting to accommodate them in work zones? Well, a lot of times it's that the normal path they take, they know that path very well. They're going to follow it exactly every day, day after day. So when something unexpected happens on that path, it can be really devastating to them being able to make that trip. And there's a fierce amount of independence in both kinds of disabled communities, because these are adults. These are people who want to get out and live their life like the rest of us are. So we need to make sure that if we're going to disrupt a normal path, we're giving them the information they need. So if there's non-detectable routes, that's going to be a problem. if there's not barriers to tell them there's something ahead, if you've created a change in that area, but you haven't put a barrier there, how is a person with low or no vision to know that they're no longer supposed to go this way? And then we also have obstructions within the path. Maybe the path itself, as Jerry said, isn't closed, but we need to let them know that we need to keep things out of their way as they're going that way as well. So here's a couple of examples that I have, and I'm going to start out with the bad examples, not to say that everybody's doing everything wrong, but just to make sure that we see some of the things we want to avoid, because maybe we're looking through a different set of eyes right now. We're not looking through, I could easily walk around this hole, but if it's a visually impaired person, if we haven't put a barrier before this, they could easily walk into this hole. And we want to make sure that we're trying to help people avoid this type of thing. So this is in the middle of an accessible route. You can see the sidewalk just beyond this. So some way people are going to need to get beyond this point without falling into this open trench. A second one, this is another one where people have tried to do what we would want them to do, to block off equipment that they have on the sidewalk. So they've created some protection around it. Unfortunately, it being at almost shoulder height for this woman isn't allowing her to detect it with her cane or to detect it before she gets to it, because she's not going to have any kind of a warning at ground level that she's come up to a change in her path. As we said, you can put obstructions into a sidewalk unintentionally. Obviously, this sign was not intended to have any impact on pedestrians. There probably wasn't a pedestrian or visual impairment thought to this road work, because it really wasn't impacting the sidewalk other than these signs being put up here. And the problem with this is that point of the sign is coming out right at about eye level for people. So as a visually impaired person walking along here, you're detecting things at ground level. That's your primary detection point. This is going to run you right into the middle of your forehead, where you're not going to be able to detect it before you walk right into it. Not a good idea. Again, this is a great sign for those of us who can see the sign. But if I'm a low vision person or a visually impaired person, I'm going to keep walking right past it, because it's not within where I would call the curb cut kind of being the primary path. That's good. They're not going to trip over it, but they're also not going to realize that sidewalk is closed ahead. And so they're going to get across the street, run into this fence, which, nice and detectable, they are going to find the fence, but they're not going to know what they're going to need to do at that point. And they're probably going to follow this fence straight over into traffic, and that's not something we want to do. One of the primary things that we talk about from the MUTCD is not wanting to lead pedestrians into conflict with traffic, and that's both in the path we're directing them on and on a path that could unintentionally be taken, such as this. So how can we help people then? If we're talking about all these visually impaired, and there's so many things we have to think about that we don't normally think about as professionals, how can we do that and get information to these special groups? There's really two kinds of information you're thinking about when you start thinking about providing information to a visually impaired person. The first being barriers, and probably the one that we think about most often, trying to get that lower rail barrier there, trying to get that secondary barrier up a little bit higher in case that you get past that lower one, or you have a low vision person that doesn't use a cane. They've got that higher barrier that they can see. Then there's the audible information side of things, and I want to talk about that for a little while, because we did quite a bit of work on this for the Texas Department of Transportation, looking at the different types of information that can be included within audible information. So I'm going to pull two more quotes from the MUTCD, and the first one is really the one I want to think about as we go through this, and it's giving visually impaired persons the equivalent information to visual signage. So anything that we would give to a motorist or to a non-impaired person when they're walking, this is what we want to make sure that somehow we're conveying to a visually impaired person. So one way to do that is with an audible information device. And the MUTCD specifically says that we need to use this device when there is an alternative route and there is not detectable barricades leading to that detectable route. So that's just like that picture I was just showing, where you would get across that sidewalk before you get to that detectable barrier, so you're not finding that alternate route. So what we did in this study that I had mentioned before was we did 2 different phases of it, looking at messages both for finding alternate routes and warning messages, just to conveying to that person that there's something changed ahead of them, letting them know maybe there's a step up that they didn't have to take before, something like this, so that they can really be prepared for what's coming ahead. And we evaluated these both in laboratory and field settings to try and find out what components within these messages can really help the visually impaired community. So we found out the first thing, which should seem obvious but really became a major point, was to clearly state the intended path. We did a lot of like turn left, turn right, trying to get very specific, when we found out that just saying use opposite side of street helped a lot better than giving those turning directions. So giving a very distinct, what do you want that person to do, is really important. We found that the 2 most critical elements within these messages was that initial, where do I need to go, or turning, so other side of the street, and then a distance that they needed to follow, that alternate route. Because if you really think about it, when you're going off and you're maybe driving to a different location, you want to know how long am I going to have to be over there before I can get back to my normal route. Is it a block? Is it 4 blocks? Is it a mile? So we tried a lot of different ways to provide distance information to people too, and we really found that blocks are very detectable because you get to a definite measuring point. You get to that curb cut. You get to that signal intersection. And so you can measure that. And also landmarks. If there's something along that way like a bridge or something like this, if you can measure using landmarks that are detectable to a person, a corner, something along these lines, that's going to give them a lot more information than saying maybe 500 feet. 500 feet is very hard to measure. For me, for a visually impaired person, probably for most of us, it's more of a visual thing. One other thing you have to think about, though, is you're trying to give these directions. So I said, let's give it in blocks. A lot of times driveways can influence how people are going to think about blocks as they're navigating along these paths. So that's another thing that has to be considered as you're counting distance within these areas for a visually impaired person. We did find that giving street names was really not the critical part of this information. We were trying to say that something was closed between 2 locations. Really, the distance was the more critical part of this information. We also found that path details are reassuring. If we told somebody that a path surface was going to change or something along these lines, those details reassured them that they could go through the area that they were approaching because they knew things had changed and they knew what they were expecting as they were coming. So then the other side of this coin is barrier information. Audible information isn't going to always be needed. A lot of times the information that needs to be gotten out to a visually impaired person is doable through barriers, and it's through detectable barriers. And this is both defining the path edge as well as detectable channelizing devices. Our cute little stick figure here who's going between the barricades is a little bit funny, but if you really think about it, if that's an open trench area or if there's active equipment within that work area that we're depicting, this could be a really bad situation as that person gets in between these barrels and gets off of the path, and they don't really know that they're off of the path. So we need to give them a very definable area that they can walk in. So a couple of things that have done this really well. This is one example of a walkway that was created that's done really well for a visually impaired person. They've created that 6 inches, under 6 inches definable line at the bottom. There's also additional rails. In this case, it's because they're using scaffolding, but it does have that additional rails that are going to help keep a person within this area. So we've created a really nice and definable path. Just kind of as a side note, as we get to the mobility impaired side of things, you can also see that they've created a wooden wheelchair ramp and a nice big platform in case there's wheelchair access in this point as well. So this is a really nice example of how to help the impaired groups get around an area. This is a second really nice example. Within this sidewalk, they've had to trench something out. Maybe it's for piping or something they're putting in. But they've also added really nice detectable lines along here, both at about mid-height and down at the ground where this person can detect it with their cane. So this has given a lot of guidance to this person that yes, you're still on the right path, and that you need to keep going this way, not to take that left, that sharp left towards the street. A final example, again, created both really nice definable edge that the person can find and has created a platform for wheelchairs to turn. One concern in this is if you look at these concrete barriers that have been used in this case, there are some, gaps, I guess is the best way to say it, gaps between the surfaces that a cane could get stuck in. So that would be something that you'd want to look at, like how could we get something in front of this to try and even out those gaps, to make it easier for a visual impaired person to get through here so that their cane would not have a chance of getting stuck within this pedestrian way. One final example, and this was one that really struck close to home because this example was right down the street from the Commission for the Blind in Washington, D.C., and it was where they were tearing out a sidewalk trying to do some repair work. And in this case, there was not a detectable edge. If you can see, there was not a step down from the curb, and there wasn't really a good detectable barricade in front of a person to know that they needed to get off the sidewalk until they ran into that caution tape. So even in the backyard of something like the Commission of the Blind, something like this can happen. The nice thing about this one was they were able to get a lot of feedback that says, hey, you're leading some people into some danger here. We need your help in trying to get this worked out. And so they came back in the next day with some barricades into this area. Were able to really give a nice defined edge, a nice defined barricade to make sure that people are safely navigating around this area and that the visually impaired as well as the wheelchair access was provided at this work zone. So I've been mentioning wheelchair access a few different times as we go through here, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about mobility impairments. What's the problems that they run into? I think wheelchair ramps is maybe one that we think about most often, but there are some other things that we need to think about. So inconsistent surfaces is another thing to think about. If you've had to change the path and it's become real ragged, maybe we've had to tear it up and put it back a couple times, this is going to be something that's going to create an inconsistent surface or an unlevel surface that in a wheelchair it could be difficult. With a walker or with a cane, it could be almost impossible for a person to cross because they don't have that ability to balance as well. That's why they're using these devices. A non-accessible route is another thing. If the ramps are gone, this type of thing, it's going to be completely inaccessible. So we need to make sure that we're leading people to accessible points. A disconnect is a problem. You might have 3 miles this way where it's perfectly accessible, only 50 feet where you have a problem, and then 3 miles the other way where it's completely accessible. But that one small disconnect could really ruin somebody's trip for the whole way through your work zone. So we need to make sure that every piece of it is connected. It's not just the beginning and the end points of that work zone. And also path width. You and I can kind of maybe squeeze by something, but if you're walking in a walker or you're in a wheelchair, you're not going to be able to kind of shimmy between things or shimmy around something. You're going to need a nicer, wider path to be able to get around different things in the work zone. And I'm going to show some examples of these again. So this is one where you get to this sidewalk closure and they told you exactly what they wanted you to do. They want you to go to the other side. They don't want you to walk in the street. Well, for the lady in the picture here, she's not listening, so we have a problem with all pedestrians not paying attention to this. We also, at this point, have a problem that there's no wheelchair ramp down at this point. So even if it was an appropriate place to send people across the street, maybe it did have a crosswalk, which it does not, there still is no wheelchair ramp here, so you're not giving mobility impaired persons the access to your alternate route. We need to bring these signs back to an accessible area. Another example of this is a sidewalk closed at a driveway. So maybe there's access at this point. You could argue that they can get down the driveway and have access around this area, but you're leading people into conflict because the closure is being given at a point where it's not accessible. And so this closure information really needs to be given ahead of time so that people at the last accessible crossing, at the last signal, at the last ramp, at the last crosswalk, have a place where they can go across safely. We do not want to lead people into this kind of a situation where the mobility impaired persons are going to have a hard time. They're going to come down this ramp almost, driveway really, and go into the street and go around this, but probably most persons are not going to turn around. And so you're leading people into conflict with traffic by not giving them that information at a safe crossing. This is another example that is really much closer to home for me. The gentleman in the picture here is actually my brother-in-law, and when we were up there last week visiting family, he had told us about a place about a half a block down the street from him where they had torn up the entire corners, and he and many of the people in his community who are mobility impaired had not been able to get through this intersection for about 4 months now. And so the interesting thing here is that the contractor had really tried to help them be able to get through this area. And you may not be able to tell from this picture, but there is some concrete that had been put in temporarily to try and make this more accessible for these gentlemen and ladies who were in wheelchairs in this area. Unfortunately, because of the way it was put in, it created a really uneven surface. And the picture doesn't really do it justice, but it was very uneven and wobbly so that the wheelchairs were still having trouble getting through here. And additionally, you came up to these bolts. You can see right near where that cone is in the picture are the old bolts that are sticking up from a previous signal pole. So all of these things were endangering the ability to get to the curb cut in this area. So these are things that in the interim of construction, they were trying to help. They're trying to do the right thing and provide access, but it really just fell a little bit short. And we need to make sure that the provisions we are providing are allowing people to use this area. So I mentioned how wide are things. This looks like, myself, I think most of the people that are in the room here could be able to get by, could walk through, but unfortunately the way the legs of the fence are sticking out and the way this light pole is, this is not enough room for anybody with a mobility impairment to be able to walk by here with a walker, a cane, a wheelchair. None of that's going to be able to have access through this point. So we need to make sure that when we're putting in these types of temporary barricades, that we're providing enough width to be able to allow people to move through the area. This is another one where you got to give the contractor a little bit of credit. He was trying to provide a ramp down from this curb to the sidewalk. And so there was this plywood that was put here as a temporary ramp. Unfortunately, it provided a lip up at the top that's not able for most people to get over, either in their wheelchairs or with their mobility devices, and really was not a safe way for people to get down from that curb onto this pedestrian way. This last example here is an example that you may be able to get up that way in a wheelchair on a nice dry day like today, but you do have incline. You also have inclement weather where this is going to turn to mud, and we're then expecting people to be able to navigate through mud and this hilly side in order to be able to follow the right path or the path that they're being instructed to. So we really have to watch where are we sending people, not just today or the day this picture was taken on a nice sunny day, but what are we expecting them to do if it's a bad weather day? So I'm going to show a couple of improvements that were made to some work zones, and really these improvements are both in ramps and in accessibility of pathways, are ways that these were really improved. This is another one where there was a need to get somebody down from a curb onto a pedestrian way, and in this case, there was a temporary, I believe it's concrete here, it could be asphalt, ramp put in order to accommodate both wheelchair and mobility impaired persons. This is another one where the sidewalks in front of an entire strip of stores was being redone. In this case, they took the parking lane from the road and then they made ramps down from most of the businesses that people could access those businesses. And the nice thing about this was they put these as ramps so that people who were mobility impaired could get up to them. The bad thing about these pictures are, if you can look a little bit closer, they're not meeting the requirements of a visually impaired person to be able to navigate through this area. So even though we've put a nice barricade between traffic and the pedestrian way. On the right-hand side, this is not going to be a detectable barrier that any visually impaired person could follow. So at last we've come to an example where I think it's really good for both groups. This is an example where they've created a pathway with both the detectable rails at the ground level and at about waist level, and where it's wide enough that you can get a wheelchair or mobility impaired person through here. So we've created a really good example of how to get people through this area. Just a couple of quick conclusions, a couple of highlighted points. So when we think about visual impairments, I think really the biggest thing in your mind to keep thinking about is what would be the equivalent of visual signage. How can I get the same information to add to the entire body of people who want to use this? And that's through barrier or audible information when you're talking about visually impaired persons. And when you start talking about mobility impairments, it's continuity, because how do you keep that entire area so that you have access by mobility impaired persons? And that's both through the access, wheelchair access, ramps, as well as surfaces. If you're leading somebody over mud, over dirt, over changing surfaces, there can be some real problems. And so we want to make sure that all these people have a chance to come through here, and that these aren't an afterthought, that these are really put into the plans from the very beginning, that all these thoughts are there so that we can really make sure that from day one, the road users have a chance to get through that work area. Just a few of the references that we used in putting all this information together. Of course, the first place we always go is going to be Part 6 of the MUTCD, and that's, you've seen, I had a couple quotes. Jerry used some quotes from his presentation. This is where kind of the fundamentals start. But as we start talking about a lot of this handicaps and disabilities, trying to help people get through there, the access board is really the stop-all for how we can help people. And so there's a contact, and there's a technical assistance board within that you can contact if you really wanted to get specific information about a location. And then these final two web links, the first one is a lot of the checklist Jerry was talking from is in this 5237 P1 report. The second one is going to be where you'll find a lot of that audible information for visually impaired persons, a lot of the work we did. And I would encourage you to look at those if you have more of a need for that type of information. And with that, I think I'm throwing it back to Brad to begin questions and discussion. Oh.
All right, thank you, Brooke. We do have a number of questions, and we'll try to fill as many of them as possible in the time that we have available. We'll have Brooke and Jerry both together answering the questions, and I will feed them to them. So start out, I think we're beginning kind of at the most recent questions. We'll move backwards. And the first question we have for you, it talks about accommodating the visually impaired. And it asks, how do you identify and confirm that the area has visually impaired around it? Does TxDOT make accommodation at all construction areas or just at selected areas?
How do you know that there's going to be visually impaired people there? That's a good question, and I don't think TxDOT at this point is not making the provisions at all work zones for visually impaired people, but I have not seen anywhere where there is a very definitive line of how you define that. How do you define how many work zones you need to be doing this at? So unfortunately, I think the answer is maybe investigate the community a little bit more. You know, if you knew you were down the street from the Commission for the Blind, hopefully that would be a really good starting point. Maybe investigate neighborhoods or school organizations. Try and find out if that's something that's required within that area.
All right. For our next question, similar to the one, should a barricade in front of the work area be striped from the upper right to the lower left to direct pedestrians which side of the path to follow, similar as you would use the chevrons in a work zone for traffic control?
I've got my opinion.
What do you think?
My opinion, that people don't really pay as much attention to that as we think they do. Obviously, you would want to use them in a chevron formation the same way you do for traffic would be the most consistent, and is to keep, you know, if you want pedestrians to go to the left of that barricade, obviously keep them going to the left. But I think it's, I would be surprised if you could find a standard person who knew that's what that meant.
Okay, our next question. How are audible signs triggered?
The one that we tested, the audible sign was triggered by proximity, and so it had a motion detector, and as you walked up to it, when you were about 15 feet away, the message started to play.
Okay, this one refers to a specific sign. It says slide 45. Now, it showed a pedestrian walkway, and there was no ground level guidance to prevent the sight impaired person from walking into the light post. I guess that was just an observation there. Mm-hmm. Next question. What kind of recourse is there for contractors and governments that fail to comply, especially on a regular and ongoing basis, to provide this type of access?
Right now, I know that the Access Board guidelines have not been officially enacted, so right now they're in draft form. The recourse, I think, is the owner agency has the responsibility. It is given the statements that have been included in the MUTCD, make it clear what the requirements are. So if they are not being met, obviously they're not in compliance with the MUTCD. From that standpoint, and the normal recourses that you would have, an owner agency would have for, not complying in that instance would apply.
Okay, next question. What is the appropriate guidance for placement of the signs that say use the other side in relation to the desired location to cross? Should it be right at the location, in advance of it, etc.?
My feel is that it should really be at the last safe place to cross. You don't want to get somebody halfway down a block and there's no safe place to cross there and then tell them the sidewalk's closed. So you need to give that information at a place where people can use it. The same way we wouldn't lead a vehicle halfway down the block and then expect them to U-turn. We don't want to do that with pedestrians either.
Okay. Next question. When a sidewalk is closed and pedestrian traffic is detoured, does the pathway that the pedestrians are detoured onto need to also meet ADA requirements? Does the existing sidewalk, pedestrians, if they're detoured, does that need to be improved if it does not meet ADA requirements? So if they send you off to another sidewalk, what are the compliance requirements there?
If the original path had compliance for ADA, then the alternate path is going to need to have compliance for ADA.
All right. Another question. It says law enforcement agencies struggle with inconsistent signing. Should we be using black and white signs for a regulatory message? And if visibility is an issue, are there other tools to improve sign visibility?
I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah, can you say that one more time?
It just talks about the color of signage. Typically we use black and white signs for regulatory signage. Now when we're dealing with ADA issues, are there certain colors or legibility issues that we need to consider?
Obviously, when you're talking about signing, you need to stay mostly with what's in the MUTCD, and what's there right now is black on white signing. So I think that's really where you need to go. We are encouraging in Workzone areas to use black on orange because it does provide a little bit more of that message, and it's a standard that's been set with the vehicle signing as far as using black on orange signs.
All right. Sorry here, screen's refreshing. Can you discuss the best way to address training of flag persons to be sensitive to and aware of those and need to adjust their actions in the presence of a handicapped person? Is there a standard reference and training material for this, flagging and ADA?
For flagging and ADA, I don't know of any standard for flagging and ADA. It's not something I've ever seen.
Okay. Another question, related, similar topic, not necessarily disabled persons, but it says, do you have any special considerations for work zones that may be in a school zone, a walking route for school-age children to and from school?
Any special considerations? Was that the question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Obviously, when you're talking about schools, there's a lot of need for a very consistent pathway. You don't want to lead 8-year-olds out into traffic the way we were talking about with a lot of these signs that happen at fences in the middle of blocks. 8-year-olds probably aren't going to turn around, so the need to provide a very consistent and very defined path through the work zone is even more important when you start talking about children.
I think we also, in the first presentation, talked about maintaining separation between the work area and the path. And in a school area with young children, I think that's even more important, the continuous fencing barriers that prohibit, strongly discourage children from cutting across a work area. Those kind of things become even more important.
Okay, next question. Are you required to provide audible devices in Workzone for pedestrians? I guess it would be for the sight impaired. And then question, for any of these kind of audible devices, as a follow-up question, how do you prevent them from being stolen?
Preventing them from being stolen, they bolt to barricades. I mean, any way you could lock them to the barricade, lock the barricade to something that's not movable. They do make such devices that can be locked straight onto poles, so more like onto your signal pole, something like this, that hopefully they can't steal from that point. As far as being required to use them, the MUTCD recommends they be used when an alternate path is not detectably defined for a visually impaired person. So if you need somebody to go across the street and then down 3 blocks and that's not continually defined for them, then an audible device needs to be considered.
Okay, very good. Question, are there, for the signed design in these types of work zones for handicapped, are there any specific guidelines for how those signs should be designed, size of letters, contrast, those types of things?
I haven't gotten into anything specific about that in the research we did.
The MUTCD, most states have standard sign design requirements, layouts. Those that are relevant to pedestrian, other types of pedestrian signs are relevant to this. I guess the big question would be whether the orange on black provides sufficient contrast for the low vision pedestrians, and we don't have any numbers on that right now to say that they do or don't.
Okay, our next question talks about in temporary sidewalks or temporary pathways. Is there any guidance on what the materials of which they should be constructed? Can it be just hard-packed earth or limestone or something like that, or does it need to be concrete or asphalt or something along those lines?
When you start talking about leading somebody over hard-packed earth, the unfortunate problem with that is earth doesn't stay hard-packed really well. So you're going to have inclement days where you're leading somebody onto hard-packed earth that is then mud. And when you're talking about pedestrians of any type, we don't want to walk through mud. So we're going to naturally gravitate away from that. When you're talking about mobility impairments, people are not going to be able to get walkers, wheelchairs, this type of thing through that mud area. So they're going to probably lead themselves into the road, which I'm going to assume is there and is available in a hard surface. So they're going to want to go that way, and they're going to not take your alternate path.
Gravel's not acceptable. I think that's okay.
Yeah, gravel's not acceptable.
Hard packed, lime stabilized base, possibly. It depends on the level. And again, it's a quality. If it's a reasonably well done, fines on the surface that provide a reasonably smooth, continuous surface as required, by the MUTCD, it may provide. Key thing would be the maintenance. I would say that someone's watching that. If it starts to degrade because of weather or other conditions, that level of smoothness is repaired and maintained at that high level. And so you probably could get away without having to put concrete, asphalt, those kinds of things down with that level of attention.
Okay, good. This kind of is similar to a question we talked about earlier, but it asks a little bit more detailed. Is there a threshold at which you need to provide accommodations for impaired persons? If there's just one in the area, does that trigger it? If there's none known, do you have to do it? How do you know when to provide these type of accommodations?
I think if you asked any advocate of the impaired community, they would say one is enough. If you knew you only had one vehicle going down a road that day, would you still make conditions so that vehicle could pass? And I think the answer is probably yes. And so I think that's the way you have to think of it, and make that decision for your agency.
If you're at pretty confident that the numbers are it's a function of your design. It depends on how long your work zone's going to be there. Is it going to be there during hours when no one will be there? That's different than if it's a very short term where the requirements are not that you always have to put a concrete path or an asphalt path down. If it's something that you can assign I think the question, a flagger to address any mobility or visually impaired pedestrian issues. I can certainly walk a person through the work zone if they're properly trained. Again, I think unfortunately we probably need some training for flaggers. That would maybe a very good suggestion that came out of the questions. Same kind of thing if that person knows how to properly assist someone who has some mobility impairments through. If you want to if you want to have a bus and bus people from one end to the other, I don't think that we want to prescribe that we're talking about all this possible solutions. It's the principles that are involved, and recognizing that you do not allow for that potential for someone who has some disabilities to be left to their own devices and being put themselves into an unsafe situation because of your work zone.
Okay, just a couple more questions here. There's some discussion going on with the questions and answers that are going back and forth again regarding the signs and the sign colors, and is orange, some discussion whether or not orange is appropriate for a regulatory sign in a work zone just because it's for pedestrians, or should we stick with black and white? Any further elaboration on what you have said previously?
This is an area that we talked quite a bit about during the research, and I think the points are well taken that a orange on black is a warning sign, a black on white is a regulatory sign. Which one is more appropriate from a standpoint? It depends on are you planning to issue, is the intent to provide advance warning, provide guidance? Are you intending to issue citations? If your traffic control plan includes heavy enforcement of pedestrian movements, certainly a regulatory sign would be appropriate. So I don't think there is a one single answer fits all kind of thing. We were surprised by the research that indicated that people take, even though they're black on red or white are the regulatory ones, the ones they should pay attention to, the indications were I pay attention to the black on orange because that's out of the normal, that's telling me something's different, and I'm going to reply. I'm more likely to comply with the black on orange than I am with the black on white, which kind of counter to the legal definitions that we have right now.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. We have one final question for you, and it deals with your channelizing devices. Some of the pathways were delineated with barrels, some with cones. Is there any regulatory information on what is the appropriate barricade or channelizing device to use when creating a temporary pedestrian pathway?
I'll go ahead and answer that. Don't take everything that we show both good and bad examples. I think a lot of things that are being referred to were the not acceptable. The requirements are clear. If you can somehow put a continuous edging on a series of cones and have a secondary level high enough that protects, I don't think there's anything that would say a cone is not allowed. A cone by itself is not allowed. A drum by itself is not allowed. You do need that continuous edging on the lower. You need the second layer for the low vision. Those are what define what's acceptable from a channelizing device standpoint, and it's up to the designer and a field personnel to figure out if that meets those principles, rather than deciding whether a cone or a barricade, or even a barricade, unless it has that lower rail, doesn't meet the requirements as put forth in the MTCD.
Well, thank you, Jerry and Brooke, very much for your participation here today. We appreciate your time in coming here. Also, for those of you who perhaps we didn't address your questions directly enough, or you have additional questions, we encourage you to log on to the Workzone Clearinghouse and use the No, the listserv to ask questions that is moderated by staff at TTI as well as many of you who can provide a lot of interesting information. So please use the listserv on the Clearinghouse. That requires just a simple registration. Again, everything there is free, and that's at workzonesafety.org. Again, a reminder that this presentation will be available as early as Friday for your viewing. A number of you had some technical issues that we saw. Some were not getting audio. Sometimes the slides weren't refreshing. We apologize for that. But again, you'll be able to watch this on the website in the video vault and be able to see everything again in case you missed something there. Again, finally, a reminder of our conferences coming up next year. Instead of having a full-blown Workzone safety conference as we have kind of every other year, in 2010 we'll be doing a series of one-day, we call them power workshops. The first one will be held in Cincinnati, Ohio on February 17th. That'll take place in conjunction with the World of Asphalt, so we encourage you to come for that one-day session. Also, on June 6th through 9th, at the International Bridge Conference in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, again, another power workshop, and that will be focused on Workzone safety issues and safety related to bridge construction and rehabilitation. So we hope we'll join you there. And again, my name is Brad Sant, Vice President of Safety for ARTBA, and also Director of the Workzone Clearinghouse. We appreciate you being here, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you very much.